Werewolf romance story, written by Judith. Prologue. The silver blade was still wet with Lyrian's blood when the High Commander turned his back, his cold justice satisfied. But as the next prisoner was dragged to the mud, a small, hooded boy with a royal signet the air in the jungle clearing turned to ice. Vera, the second in command, felt the weight of her own sister's recent death burning in her chest like a physical fire. Commander Kaelen realized too late that the rebel his men had captured was his only son, Elias, misidentified in the chaos. He dropped to his knees, the same knees Vera had just begged at, but Vera did not offer him the mercy he had denied her. She stepped forward, the executioner's sword heavy in her hand, her eyes locked on the man who had destroyed her world. "You told me the law is absolute, Commander," she whispered, the steel whistling through the air. "Now watch your law work." Chapter 1. The Jungle Purge. The jungle of the Black Ridge did not offer sanctuary. It offered a slow, humid death. Here, the air was a physical weight, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation, damp earth, and the metallic tang of old blood. This was the edge of the world, where the High Commander's blood law was enforced not with ink and parchment, but with silver and shadow. Vera, the second in command of the Silver Vanguard, moved through the dense ferns with the silent lethality of a panther. Her leather armor was slick with condensation, and her heart hammered against her ribs in a rhythm she struggled to control. Beside her, being shoved forward by a callous guard, was her younger sister, Lyrian. Lyrian was never meant for this world. While Vera had spent her life honing her blade to protect what remained of their lineage, Lyrian had spent hers coaxing life from the soil. Even now, with her hands bound by rough hemp rope, Lyrian clutched a small bundle of ether root, a plant known for stopping internal bleeding. To the High Council, however, it was evidence of blood witchcraft, a crime punishable by the clearing. "Keep your head down, Lyrian," Vera whispered, her voice a low, raspy warning. "Do not speak. Do not look at him." Him was High Commander Kaelen. He sat atop a black war stallion at the center of the clearing, a man who seemed to absorb the very light of the jungle. He was magnificent in a way that felt like a threat, broad-shouldered, clad in dark, ornate plate armor that bore the scars of 100 skirmishes. His eyes were the color of molten gold, cold and predatory, scanning the line of prisoners with the detached interest of a god deciding which ants to crush. Vera's one specific wound, the memory of watching their mother be taken by a similar purge, pulsed in her mind. She had spent years rising through the ranks of Kaelen's army, hiding her heritage, proving her loyalty, all to ensure Lyrian would never stand in a line like this. And yet, here they were. "Commander," Vera said, stepping forward as they reached the center of the muddy clearing. She kept her posture rigid, her chin parallel to the earth. It was her quiet strength, the ability to stand in the eye of a storm without blinking. "The girl is my sister. She was found gathering herbs for the village elders. There is no rebellion in her." Kaelen shifted his gaze. When his eyes landed on Vera, the air between them seemed to vanish. There was a history there, months of long watches on the battlements, sparse but meaningful exchanges about strategy, and a tension that had always felt like a wire stretched to the breaking point. Kaelen respected Vera. Perhaps, in the dark corners of his soul, he felt more than respect. But he was a man of the law. "The law of the purge is absolute, Vera," Kaelen said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in Vera's chest. "Anyone found with the old blood mark or practicing the old ways within the restricted zones is a threat to the stability of the North." "She is a healer," Vera's voice cracked the stillness of the jungle. "She has saved your own men, Kaelen. Last winter, when the frost fever took the barracks, who brewed the tea that broke the sweat? It was her. Is that the treason you mean to execute?" Kaelen's jaw tightened. He looked at Lyrian, small, trembling, and clearly innocent of any political maneuvering. For a fleeting second, a shadow of hesitation crossed his features. He saw the desperation in Veyra's eyes, the raw, bleeding love she held for the girl. It was the first time he had ever seen Veyra's dignity arc tremble. But behind Kaelen stood the High Council's inquisitors, their eyes narrow and hungry. To show mercy here was to admit the law was fallible. To save Veyra's sister was to risk his own crown. "The accusation is baseless," Veyra continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "You know this is not justice. This is fear." "Enough!" Kaelen barked, though the word felt heavy in his mouth. He looked away from Veyra, unable to endure the silent accusation in her stare. "The prisoners will be processed by sunset. If they cannot prove their lineage is untainted, the clearing will claim them. Kaelen." Veyra stepped closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the silver signet on his gauntlet, a gesture of intimacy that shocked the surrounding guards. Kaelen pulled his hand back as if burned. The physical distance between them felt like a canyon. "I am the commander of the vanguard, Veyra, and you are my second. Do not make me choose between my duty and your head." Veyra stood frozen as Kaelen turned his horse away, the mud splashing her boots. She looked at Lyrian, who was being dragged toward the holding pens. Lyrian didn't scream. She simply looked back at Veyra with wide, trusting eyes, believing that her big sister would find a way. Veyra felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. She had served this man. She had bled for his borders. She had even begun to let herself feel the stirrings of a forbidden attraction to the golden-eyed monster who ruled the north. But as the sun began to dip below the canopy, casting long, bloody shadows across the clearing, Veyra realized that Kaelen's mercy was a myth. She watched him go, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger. Her quiet strength was still there, but it was shifting. It was no longer the strength of endurance. It was becoming the strength of a reckoning. The jungle was silent, save for the sharpening of blades and the distant, panicked cry of a bird. The jungle purge had begun, and by the time the moon rose, the blood of the innocent would call for a price that Kaelen was not yet prepared to pay. Chapter 2. The First Blade. The transition from the jungle's emerald canopy to the gray, stone-cold reality of the Black Spire execution square was a descent into a nightmare. The ground here was not soil, but a slurry of freezing mud and the crushed remains of those who had dared to defy the High Council's rigid blood law. The sky above hung low and heavy, a bruised violet that promised a storm, but for now, the air was eerily still, save for the rhythmic clink of silver-tipped spears hitting the ground as the vanguard took their positions. Veyra was no longer a commander, she was a witness. They had stripped her of her officer's mantle, leaving her in a thin linen tunic that offered no protection against the biting wind. Her hands were bound behind her back, the rough hemp biting into her wrists, but her eyes remained fixed on the dais where Kaelen sat. He looked like a statue of ancient, unforgiving granite. His golden eyes were hooded, avoiding the row of prisoners kneeling in the muck. Beside Veyra, Lyrian was trembling so violently that the mud splashed around her knees. The girl's face was ghost white, her soft features contorted in a silent plea. "Commander!" Veyra's voice cracked the stillness, echoing off the high stone walls. It wasn't a shout of anger. It was a desperate, final pull on the thread of connection she believed still existed between them. "Look at her. Look at the girl you are about to butcher. This is not the law, this is a sacrifice to your own pride." Kaelen didn't move, but the muscle in his jaw ticked. To his left, the high priest of the council, a man with eyes like sunken pits of charcoal, leaned in. "She challenges your authority before the men, Commander. To falter now is to admit the law is a suggestion, not a mandate. The bloodline must stay pure." Kaelen rose from his seat, his dark cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a scavenger bird. He descended the stone steps, his heavy boots squelching in the mud until he stood directly in front of Vera. The power imbalance was staggering. He towered over her, the apex predator of the north, while she was forced to look up at him from the dirt. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kaelen reached out and hooked his gloved finger under Vera's chin, forcing her head back. "You spoke of mercy in the jungle, Vera," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that only she could hear. "But you forgot the first lesson of the vanguard. Mercy is a luxury for the victorious. The defeated only have the truth." "The truth is that you are a coward, Kaelen," Vera whispered, her breath hitching as his thumb grazed the line of her jaw. Even in this moment of absolute degradation, the forbidden spark flickered between them, a treacherous heat that made her despise herself. "You hide behind these gray stones because you're afraid to see that the world is more than your father's rules." Kaelen's eyes flared, a flash of genuine pain crossing his face before he suppressed it. He leaned closer, his scent of cedar and cold iron overwhelming her. "If I save her, I lose the North. If I lose the North, thousands more will die in the civil war that follows. Is one girl's life worth the fire of a kingdom?" "To me?" "Yes," Vera spat, a single tear escaping her eye despite her iron resolve. "Because she is the only part of this world that is still kind." Kaelen pulled away, his face turning into a mask of stone. He turned toward the crowd, his voice booming with a forced authority that felt like a death knell. "The healer, Lyrian of Oakhaven, has been found guilty of harboring the forbidden blood and practicing the arts of the old gods. The sentence is death by the silver blade." Vera's world fractured. "No, Kaelen, stop. Take me instead. I have the mark. I am the one you want." She tried to lung forward, to throw her body over her sister's, but two guards caught her by the shoulders, slamming her back down into the mud. She fought with the strength of a dying animal, her screams tearing at the very fabric of the gray afternoon. "Please, I'll do anything." "I'll serve you. I'll stay in the dungeons. Just let her go." Kaelen didn't look back. He raised his hand, the gold signet on his finger catching a stray beam of light. He held it for a heartbeat where the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, his hand dropped. The executioner, a hulking man in a leather hood, stepped forward. Lyrian looked at Vera one last time. There was no anger in the girl's eyes, only a heartbreaking, confused sadness. She opened her mouth to speak, to say Vera's name, but the silver blade was swifter than any word. The sound was a dull, sickening thud. Vera's scream died in her throat, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt as if the mountains themselves had collapsed onto the square. She watched, paralyzed, as her sister's life spilled out into the gray mud, the bright, vibrant red of Lyrian's blood mixing with the filth of Blackspire. Kaelen stood with his back to the scene, his shoulders rigid. He didn't see the light leave Lyrian's eyes, but he heard the sound of Vera's spirit breaking. It was a hollow, jagged sound, like glass shattering in a vacuum. Vera didn't struggle anymore. She slumped against the guards, her forehead touching the mud. She felt the heat of the forbidden attraction she had once felt for Kaelen turn into a cold, black ash. He had shown no mercy. He had taken the one light she had left and extinguished it for a law that didn't even love him back. "Clean the block," Kaelen commanded, though his voice sounded like it was coming from miles away. "Bring the final prisoner forward. Let us finish this." Vera lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were no longer those of a loyal soldier or a grieving sister. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the end of the world and decided she was the one who would burn what was left. She watched the guards drag a small, hooded figure toward the blood-stained wood, and she felt a dark, cold premonition settle in her marrow. The commander thought the debt was settled. He didn't know the price of the first blade was only the down payment on his own destruction. Chapter 3. The Second Prisoner. The smell of copper hung heavy in the humid air, thick enough to taste. Vera's knees were numb, sinking deeper into the filth of the square, but she felt nothing. The world had gone monochromatic, the vibrant green of the jungle and the gold of Kaelen's eyes washed out by the gray of her sister's absence. The next rebel, the high priest croaked, his voice cutting through the ringing in Vera's ears. Bring him to the light. Let the people see the face of the corruption that seeks to unseat our commander. 2 guards dragged a small figure forward. The prisoner was shorter than the others, his frame slight and trembling under a heavy, mud-caked cloak. A thick burlap hood obscured his head, but his hands were bound with a specific type of leather restraint fine, braided calfskin, not the iron or hemp used for commoners. Vera's eyes, glazed with a grief that bordered on catatonia, sharpened. As the prisoner was shoved past her, his foot slipped in the mire. He fell toward her, his bound hands catching himself against Vera's thigh. For a split second, the sleeve of his tunic rode up. There, on his wrist, was a silver charm tied with a blue silk thread. It was a sunburst, the crest of the High Commander's private household. But more than the metal, it was the small, distinct birthmark beneath it, a cluster of 3 freckles like a constellation that stopped Vera's heart. Elias. Vera had seen that mark years ago, in the brief window of peace before the blood law had turned the North into a slaughterhouse. Kaelen had sent his only son away to the southern monasteries, claiming the boy needed tempering, but Vera knew the truth. Kaelen had been trying to hide the boy from the council's growing fanaticism. The boy under the hood was not a rebel. He was Kaelen's heart. A dark, jagged realization tore through Vera. The scouts had reported a group of cloaked infiltrators near the border, the same border Elias would have to cross to return home. The council must have intercepted the boy's carriage, stripped his guards, and thrown him into the prisoner transport to test Kaelen. Or perhaps they wanted him dead so they could claim the lineage was broken. Vera looked at Kaelen. He was staring at the horizon, his jaw set in a line of agonizing resolve. He was playing the part of the stoic leader so perfectly that he couldn't see the boy 3 feet away from him was his own flesh. Kaelen, Vera whispered. He didn't turn. Commander, she said louder, her voice raspy and raw. Look at the boy. Look at who you are judging. Kaelen's eyes finally snapped to hers. The hatred in them was tempered by a flicker of confusion. Silence, Vera. You have lost your right to speak. Your sister's blood is on your hands for your insolence. Do not add more weight to your soul. My soul is already gone, Vera said, standing up slowly. The guards reached for her, but she shoved them back with a sudden, violent strength born of pure adrenaline. You talk of the law. You talk of the blood. But you are blind. You are about to cut the very thread that holds your world together. The prisoner was caught at the border without papers, carrying the sigil of the southern rebels. The high priest shouted, sensing the shift in the air. He is a spy, executioner. Do not delay. The hooded boy let out a small, muffled sob. The sound was high-pitched, the cry of a child who didn't understand why the world was hurting him. Kaelen flinched. That sound, it echoed a memory he had buried deep. But his pride, the authority imbalance that had defined him for years, kept him anchored to his seat. He believed Vera was playing a game, a desperate attempt to manipulate his emotions after the death of her sister. You think to trick me with a child's tears? Kaelen's voice was a low snarl, but there was a tremor in it. The law does not care for age, it cares for loyalty. Loyalty? Vera laughed, a bitter, jagged sound that chilled the guards. She looked at the executioner, who was already stepping toward the boy. Then she looked back at Kaelen. She saw the man she had almost loved. She saw the man who had just stood by while her sister was murdered. and she saw the opportunity for a reckoning so absolute it would scream through history. In that moment, the quiet strength Vera had carried her whole life curdled into something sharper. If Kaelen wanted a world governed by cold, unyielding law, she would give it to him. She would show him the true meaning of no mercy. "Then let it be done," Vera said, her voice suddenly terrifyingly calm. She stepped back, allowing the guards to take her arms again. "If the law is absolute, then the law must be satisfied. Isn't that right, Commander?" Kaelen frowned, unsettled by her sudden compliance. He looked at the hooded figure. Something felt wrong. The air was too thick, the silence of the jungle too heavy. He felt a sudden, cold sweat break out at the base of his spine. "Wait," Kaelen said, his hand rising. "Commander, we are behind schedule," the priest urged, his voice oily. "The sun is setting. The spirits of the law demand the sacrifice before the moon rises." Kaelen looked at the boy. He looked at Vera. He saw the cold, dead look in her eyes, the look of a woman who was already standing on the other side of a grave. "Unveil him," Kaelen commanded. His heart began to thud against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic warning. "I want to see the face of this spy before he dies." The law forbids the unveiling of a traitor before the blade falls, lest their gaze curse the square. The priest countered quickly. "Commander, do not let your grief for your second's betrayal cloud your judgment." Kaelen hesitated. He was the High Commander, but the council held the religious reins of the pack. To defy them now, after just executing a girl for the blood law, would be a political suicide. Vera watched him. She saw the exact moment his cowardice won over his instinct. She saw him settle back into his chair. "Proceed," Kaelen whispered. Vera's eyes went to the executioner. The man raised the silver blade, the same blade that still bore Lyrian's blood. The boy was forced down onto the block. The hood was tucked away from the neck, exposing a patch of pale, innocent skin and the silver chain of the sunburst charm. Vera didn't close her eyes. She leaned forward, her heart a cold stone. "Watch closely, Kaelen," she whispered into the wind. "Watch the justice you built." Chapter 4. Eye for an Eye. The sun had finally dipped below the jagged silhouette of the iron peaks, leaving the clearing in a state of unnatural, bruised twilight. The humidity of the jungle had turned into a clinging mist that smelled of wet stone and copper. On the dais, High Commander Kaelen sat as if carved from the very mountain, immobile, his golden eyes fixed on a point far beyond the blood-stained block. He was a man drowning in the silence he had created, yet his pride held his head above the water. Vera stood between two guards, her body no longer trembling. The grief for Lyrian had settled into a cold, crystalline resolve. She looked at the hooded boy, his small shoulders shaking as the executioner's shadow stretched over him. She looked at the silver charm on the boy's wrist, the sunburst of the House of Kaelen, and then she looked at the man who had ordered her sister's death. "One last time, Commander," Vera said, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a whetted blade. "Is the law absolute? Does it bend for no man, no matter the blood that flows in the veins of the accused?" Kaelen's gaze shifted to her, his brow furrowed in a flicker of irritation and deep-seated unease. "You ask a question you already know the answer to, Vera. To bend the law is to break the pack. I have sacrificed peace for this order. I have sacrificed everything." "Then let the sacrifice be complete," Vera whispered. The high priest raised his gnarled staff. "The time of shadows is here. Executioner, do your duty. Purge the rebellion from our soil." The executioner stepped forward, his heavy boots squelching in the mire. He gripped the hilt of the silver blade, the same blade that was still warm with Lyrian's innocence. He positioned himself behind the boy. "Wait!" Kaelen suddenly stood, his chair scraping violently against the stone. The authority imbalance that had kept him seated shattered under the weight of an instinct he couldn't name. "Unveil him," Now, I will not have it said I executed a ghost. The ritual is already begun, Commander, the priest hissed, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hunger. To stop now is to invite the curse of the old gods upon the lineage. But Kaelen was moving. He vaulted over the railing of the dais, his heavy armor clanking as he landed in the mud. He strode toward the block, his hand reaching for the hood. Vera moved faster. She had been a soldier of the vanguard for 10 years. She knew the rhythm of the executioner's strike. She knew that the man in the leather mask was trained to strike the moment the commander entered the circle of justice. As Kaelen reached out, Vera slammed her shoulder into the guard to her left, snatched the silver dagger from his belt, and threw it with a precision born of 1,000 hours of practice. The dagger didn't hit the executioner. It hit the wooden post beside the block, a prearranged signal for the executioner, a man who had been Vera's friend before the law turned them into monsters. The man flinched, his training taking over. Seeing the flash of silver and the commander's approach, he assumed the order was, execute. The silver blade swung. No! Kaelen's scream ripped through the jungle, a sound so primal it seemed to stop the very heartbeat of the world. He was inches away. His fingers brushed the burlap of the hood just as the steel connected. The weight of the blow sent the small body sprawling into the mud at Kaelen's feet. The hood fell away in the struggle, rolling back to reveal the face of a 10-year-old boy. His eyes were wide, blue as the summer sky, and rapidly glazing over. A single, perfect tear tracked through the dirt on his cheek. Elias. Kaelen fell to his knees, his hands hovering over the boy, afraid to touch the carnage he had authored. Elias, no, my son, my only son. He gathered the small, broken form into his arms, his regal armor staining red. He rocked back and forth, a guttural, repetitive moan escaping his throat. The square fell into a deathly, horrified hush. Even the high priest backed away, his face pale as ash. The guards lowered their spears, their eyes darting to the ground. The jungle justice they had championed had just devoured its own creator. Vera stood in the center of the clearing, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She watched the man who had shown Lyrian no mercy. She watched him howl into the neck of his dead child. The emotional justice was absolute, but it felt like a cold, hollow victory. You told me the law was a blind god, Kaelen, Vera said, her voice devoid of emotion, a ghost speaking to a corpse. You told me it did not care for the intent of the heart. My sister was a healer. Your son was a child. The law has been satisfied. Are you proud of your order now? Kaelen looked up at her. His golden eyes were shattered, the pupils blown wide with a grief that bordered on madness. He looked at the blood on his hands, the blood of his son, mixed with the blood of Vera's sister. You knew, Kaelen whispered, his voice cracking. You knew it was him. You let the blade fall. I begged you, Vera replied, her voice rising with a sudden jagged power. I knelt in this very mud and gave you my soul for a life that was innocent. You chose the law. I simply allowed you to live by the rules you forced upon us all. An eye for an eye, Commander. A life for a life. Kaelen's grief suddenly curdled into a dark, desperate rage. He looked at his dead son, then at the woman standing before him, the woman who was the only other person in the world who understood the depth of this horror. The authority imbalance shifted one final time. He didn't want to kill her. He wanted to consume her. He wanted to bind her to this tragedy so she could never leave him alone in the dark. He stood up, the body of his son still clutched to his chest. He looked at Vera with a terrifying, predatory intensity. The bloodline is broken, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. You took the air of the North. You destroyed the future of the pack. The pack was built on a graveyard, Vera said, her chin lifting. I only added the final stone. No, Kaelen said, stepping toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole. You will not walk away from this. If you have taken the life of my son, then you will be the one to replace him. You will carry the blood you spilled. You will bear the air that will fix what we have broken." Vera flinched, the horror of his words hitting her harder than any blade. "I would rather die." "You don't get to die, Vera," Kaelen whispered, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and a dark, twisted obsession. "We are bound now, by blood, by death, and you will stay by my side until the debt is paid in full. The debt is signed in blood, and the price is a soul. If the darkness of this reckoning has gripped your heart, you belong here. Subscribe so her rise finds you. Now, let us see how she survives the commander's shadow." Chapter 5. The Blood Debt. The atmosphere within the high fortress of Blackspire had shifted from the cold efficiency of a military stronghold to the suffocating stillness of a tomb. Outside, the jungle reclaimed the clearing where the mud had drunk the blood of a healer and a prince. But inside these stone walls, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed grief and burning tallow. Kaelen had not spoken since the night of the execution. He moved through the corridors like a wraith, his golden eyes hollowed out, his once resplendent armor discarded for a simple, dark tunic. The authority imbalance was now a jagged, broken thing. His men feared him not for his command, but for the volatile silence that seemed to radiate from him. Vera sat in the center of the high tower, her wrists no longer bound by hemp, but by silver shackles that allowed her to move within the room but never beyond the heavy oak door. She did not pace. She did not weep. Her dignity arc had hardened into something impenetrable. She sat by the narrow slit of a window, watching the mist roll over the peaks, her mind replaying the sound of the blade and the sight of Elias's blue eyes. The heavy iron bolt slid back with a visceral screech. Kaelen entered. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had stared into the sun and gone blind. He carried a tray, bread, wine, and a small bowl of mountain broth, but he didn't set it down. He simply stood there, watching her, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. "Eat," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its melodic authority. Vera didn't turn. "The dead do not hunger, Kaelen, and you killed me the moment you dropped your hand in that square. You are not dead." Kaelen stepped closer, the heat of his body cutting through the damp chill of the tower. "You are the only thing in this fortress that still has a pulse. Everyone else is a ghost, especially me." "Then let me go," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were hard, reflecting the gray light of the storm outside. "The debt is paid. You took my sister. I took your son. Let the cycle end in this room." Kaelen set the tray on the stone table with a violent crash. He lunged forward, grabbing the arms of her chair, pinning her in place. His face was inches from hers, so close she could see the gold flecks in his shattered eyes and the raw, red agony that simmered beneath the surface. "The cycle does not end until the blood is replaced," he hissed. "The council is circling, Vera. They see my grief as weakness. They think the lineage is ended, that they can appoint a new commander from their own corrupted ranks. They want to turn the North into a permanent slaughterhouse." "And you think I care for your politics?" Vera whispered, her voice steady despite the predatory proximity of the man who had ruined her. "Let them burn it. Let them tear each other apart until there is nothing left but ash. It would be a mercy. I will not let my son's memory be a footnote in a council coup." Kaelen's grip tightened on the chair, the wood groaning. "And I will not let the Kaelith bloodline die with you. You carry the power of the speakers. Elias carried the strength of the North. If I cannot have him back, I will have what he represented, through you." Vera felt a cold shiver of dread. "You cannot force a soul into existence, Kaelen. You cannot use me as a vessel for your regret." "I am the High Commander," he said, though the words sounded like a curse. "I have taken what I wanted from the world through force my entire life. but with you." He paused, his gaze dropping to her mouth, a flicker of that dark, forbidden attraction surfacing through the pain. "With you, I realized that I want more than just a replacement. I want the only person who knows exactly what I've lost." He reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. It wasn't a violent gesture. It was something worse. It was a plea. "You executed my son," Kaelen whispered, his voice breaking. "You watched the blade fall. You chose that justice." "I gave you the world you built," Vera shouted, her composure finally cracking. She stood up, her silver shackles clashing. "I showed you what no mercy looks like. Does it taste bitter, Kaelen? Does it choke you at night?" "It kills me," he admitted, his head bowing. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him, and then I see you. You are the only thing that makes the vision stop. You are my penance, Vera, and I will be yours." He moved toward her, his intent clear. The authority imbalance shifted into the dark, domestic tension of the forced union. He didn't use his strength to overpower her. He used his brokenness to draw her in. He trapped her between his body and the cold stone wall, his hands framing her face. "The law demands a life for a life," Kaelen murmured against her skin. "I will not execute you. I will bind you to me. You will bear the air of the North. You will give me back what you took, and in return, I will give you the power to change the laws that killed our siblings." "I hate you," Vera whispered, though her breath was hitching. The trauma they shared acted like a perverse magnet, pulling them together in a way that felt like both a sin and a necessity. "I know," Kaelen replied, his lips grazing hers. "Hate me, burn me, but stay, carry the blood. Let us turn this graveyard into a garden, even if we have to plant it in the dark." He kissed her, then a desperate, bruising encounter that tasted of salt and iron. It wasn't the kiss of a lover, it was the collision of two wrecks. Vera fought him for a heartbeat, her hands fisted against his chest, but as the weight of their mutual grief crashed over them, her fingers curled into his tunic. She didn't surrender. She endured. In the silence of the tower, amidst the shadows of the dead, the first crack in the power structure of the North appeared. Kaelen thought he was claiming a prize to satisfy a debt. He didn't realize that by bringing the divine speaker into his bed, he was inviting the light that would eventually expose every lie he had ever told himself. The blood debt was signed. As the moon rose over the black spire, Vera looked past Kaelen's shoulder at the empty sky, her heart a cold, hard ember. She would bear his child. She would replace the heir, but she would do it on her own terms, and one day, she would make sure the commander understood that some debts can never be paid in full. Chapter 6. The Forced Bond. Months bled into a singular, agonizing blur within the limestone walls of Blackspire. The humid jungle heat had given way to the biting alpine winter, and the fortress felt less like a seat of power and more like a gilded cage where two wounded predators were forced to share the same air. Vera's silver shackles had been removed, replaced by the invisible chains of a growing life. Her body, once lean and corded with the muscle of a soldier, was softening, rounding a physical manifestation of the debt Kaelen had demanded she pay. She stood on the balcony of the High Commander's private chambers, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. The child within kicked a sharp, insistent reminder of the night the law had been replaced by a dark, desperate bargain. Vera's dignity arc remained her only armor. Even as her body was claimed by the lineage that had murdered her sister, her spirit remained a fortress he could not breach. Behind her, the heavy oak doors groaned. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. Kaelen's scent, cold cedar, iron, and a hint of the winter wind always preceded him. "The healers say you have not eaten today," Kaelen said. His voice was no longer the thunderous roar of the execution square. It had become a low, haunting rasp, seasoned by a grief that had never truly left him. "The healers worry for your heir, Kaelen," Vera replied, her voice steady and sparse. "They do not worry for me." Kaelen stepped onto the balcony, his presence casting a long shadow over her. He was no longer the immaculate commander. He wore a simple black tunic, his hair unkempt, his golden eyes perpetually bloodshot. He reached out as if to touch her shoulder, then hesitated, his hand hovering in the cold air before dropping back to his side. "I worry for you," he whispered. Vera let out a short, jagged laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Do not lie to yourself. You worry that the vessel might crack before the bloodline is restored. You see a replacement for Elias. You do not see me." Kaelen moved then, stepping into her space with a sudden, controlled intensity. He didn't grab her, but he leaned over the stone railing, trapping her between his arms without touching her skin. "I see nothing but you, Vera. Every time I look at the council, I see the men who tricked me. Every time I look at my sword, I see the blade that took your sister. But when I look at you, the noise stops." Vera turned her head, her gaze clashing with his. The authority imbalance was shifting. He was the commander, but he was a man starving for a forgiveness she refused to grant. This was the forbidden romance, a spark born not of light, but of the friction between two souls who should have been enemies unto death. "I will never forgive you," she said, her voice a ghost of a promise. "I am not asking for forgiveness," Kaelen murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I am asking for a reason to keep the fire burning. The council is plotting, Vera. They know you carry the speaker's blood. They fear the child will have the power to expose their corruption. They want you dead before the spring thaw." A flicker of concern crossed Vera's face, not for herself, but for the life she carried. Despite the circumstances of its conception, the child was Lyrian's blood too. It was the only part of her sister left in the world. "Let them try," Vera said, her quiet strength flaring. "I have survived your law, Kaelen. I will survive their daggers." Kaelen reached out again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. His large, calloused hand covered hers on the stone railing. The contact was electric, a searing heat that defied the winter chill. Vera tried to pull away, but his grip was firm, not with force, but with a desperate, grounding need. "I will not let them touch you," Kaelen said, his eyes burning with a sudden protective fire that made Vera's heart skip a treacherous beat. "I failed Elias. I failed Lyrian. I will burn this entire mountain to ash before I fail you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. It was an act of submission that shattered the last remnants of his commander's mask. In the silence of the balcony, amidst the falling snow, the first spark of something true ignited. It wasn't the sweeping romance of a bard's song. It was the dark, heavy gravity of two people who had nothing left but each other. Vera felt her resolve softening, a terrifying warmth spreading through her chest. She hated the way his scent calmed her. She hated the way his touch made her feel safe. But as he stood there, broken and bloodied by his own choices, she saw the man he could have been, the man she might have loved in a world without blood laws. "Why?" she whispered, her breath hitching. "Why do you care now?" Kaelen pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his thumb grazing the back of her hand. "Because you are the only one who looked at me and saw a monster, and stayed anyway. Because you took my son's life to show me the truth, and I realized I would rather be hated by you than loved by anyone else." He didn't kiss her. He simply held her hand as the moon rose over the iron peaks. For the first time, the forced bond felt less like a sentence and more like a sanctuary. The psychological shift was complete. Kaelen was no longer her jailer, and she was no longer his prisoner. They were two survivors standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to either lift them or cast them down. "The child will be born in 2 moons," Vera said, her voice dropping to a meaningful whisper. "And when they come, Kaelen, the world you built will have to end." "I know," Kaelen replied, his grip tightening on her hand. "I'll be the one to light the match." Chapter 7. The Divine Birth. The storm that had been brewing in the heavens finally collided with the storm within the walls of Blackspire. A jagged vein of lightning split the sky, illuminating the high chamber where Vera lay gripped by the first rhythmic agonies of labor. The room smelled of lavender, iron, and the sharp ozone scent of the coming gale. Vera's fingers dug into the silk sheets, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged, controlled hitches. She refused to scream. Even now, with her body being torn asunder to bring forth the heir of her enemy, she maintained her dignity arc. She would not give the stone walls the satisfaction of her pain. Kaelen was a ghost at her bedside. He had shed his boots and his cloak, pacing the small space with the frantic energy of a caged wolf. Every time Vera gasped, he flinched as if a physical blade had struck him. "The healers say the moon is high," Kaelen whispered, leaning over her, his golden eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread. "They say the time is near." "The time. For your debt. To be paid," Vera managed to choke out, her eyes snapping open to lock onto his. Even in the throes of labor, her gaze was a challenge. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the chamber didn't just open. They were blasted inward. The boom of wood splintering drowned out the thunder. Kaelen was on his feet in a heartbeat, his hand finding the hilt of the dark steel sword he had kept leaned against the bedpost. The high priest stood in the doorway, flanked by a dozen members of the council's private guard. Their silver armor glinted maliciously in the flickering candlelight. "The law has been perverted long enough," the priest bellowed, his voice thin and shrill. "The commander has bedded the traitor. He seeks to put a bastard of the forbidden blood on the throne of the North. By the decree of the elders, the pregnancy is an abomination. It must be ended before the sun rises." Kaelen didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Vera, his massive frame shielding her from the glint of their weapons. The authority imbalance had flipped entirely. He was no longer the enforcer of their law. He was the primary obstacle to it. "You speak of the law?" Kaelen's voice was a low, lethal vibration that made the candles sputter. "I am the law in this mountain. And if you step 1 foot closer to this bed, you will find out how deep the jungle mud truly goes." "Kill him!" the priest shrieked. "And the woman!" The guards lunged. The room erupted into a cinematic chaos of clashing steel and desperate grunts. Kaelen fought with a savagery the North had not seen in decades. He wasn't fighting for a crown or a border. He was fighting for the woman who had shown him the truth of his own soul. He took a shallow cut to the shoulder, then another to the thigh, but he didn't falter. He was a wall of black iron and golden fury. On the bed, Vera felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the labor. It was the Kaelith blood, the divine speaker within her, responding to the threat. As a guard broke through Kaelen's line and raised a mace to strike her, Vera didn't flinch. She opened her mouth and let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a word. The air in the room solidified. The guard was thrown backward as if struck by a physical wave, his armor crumpling against the stone wall. The vibrations of Vera's voice shattered the glass of the windows, the shards falling like diamonds into the dark. Kaelen turned, his eyes wide as he witnessed the awakening of her hidden power. "Vera! Finish it!" she gasped, her back arching as the final transition took hold. "Kaelen! The children! They are coming!" Inspired by her strength, Kaelen redoubled his efforts. He drove the high priest and the remaining guards back toward the door, his sword a blur of silver and shadow. He kicked the heavy door shut and jammed his sword through the iron handles, barring it. He collapsed to his knees by the bed, his breath coming in heavy heaves, his blood dripping onto the stone floor. He reached out, his calloused hand finding Vera's. "I am here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I am here, Vera. I will not let them in." The final push was a collision of worlds. Vera's divine bloodline flared, a soft golden light radiating from her skin, filling the dark room with a warmth that felt like a summer morning in the jungle. A sharp, high-pitched cry pierced the silence, followed immediately by another. The healers, who had been hiding in the shadows of the alcove, rushed forward. Kaelen watched, frozen, as they lifted two small, squalling bundles. "A boy," the lead healer whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "And a girl. Twins, Commander. They are perfect." Vera slumped back against the pillows, her sweat-soaked hair clinging to her forehead. She looked at the children as they were brought to her. The girl had a shock of dark hair and small, delicate hands that immediately reached out, searching for comfort. The boy was quieter, his eyes even as a newborn holding a strange, ancient clarity. Kaelen leaned over them, his large hand trembling as he touched the girl's cheek. She has Lyrian's brow," he whispered, a sob finally escaping his throat. He looked at the boy, who had gripped Kaelen's finger with a strength that was startling. "And he has the eyes of my son." Vera looked at Kaelen, and for the first time, the enemies to lovers tension resolved into a profound, shared understanding. They had both lost everything. They had both committed unforgivable sins, but in the wreckage of their lives, they had created something that the Council could never understand, a future built on the ruins of their pride. "The girl will be Lyrian," Vera said, her voice a soft, meaningful chime. "And the boy," Kaelen replied, looking at the child who bore the mark of the heir, "he will be Elias." Outside, the Council began to batter at the door again, but Kaelen didn't move. He sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Vera, watching the two lives they had brought into the world. The jungle justice was dead. Something else, something divine and untamed was beginning. Chapter 8. Reincarnation of Peace. The iron gates of Blackspire, once symbols of an unyielding and blood-soaked regime, stood open. The winter frost was beginning to weep, turning into clear rivulets that fed the parched roots of the mountain pines. It had been 3 days since the High Council was dismantled not by a foreign army, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of the truth. When the soldiers saw their High Commander emerge from the birth chamber, wounded and weary, carrying 2 infants who radiated the ancient, golden light of the Caliph, the blood law had simply evaporated. No man would lift a sword against a miracle. Vera stood on the highest battlements, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. She was wrapped in a cloak of heavy black fur, a gift from Kaelen that she no longer felt the need to reject. In her arms, she held the girl, Lyrian. The infant was unnaturally calm, her eyes a startling, clear green, watching the movement of the clouds with a focused intensity that made Vera's heart ache. The girl didn't cry. She reached out with tiny petal-soft fingers to touch the stone of the parapet, and where she touched, a small sprig of mountain lichen turned a vibrant, healthy emerald. "She has her spirit," Vera whispered into the wind. "She does not fear the height." "And he does not fear the shadows," a deep voice replied. Kaelen stepped up beside her. He looked transformed. The predatory sharpness of his features had been blunted by a profound, quiet peace. In his arms was the boy, Elias. The child was robust, his grip already strong enough to tug at the silver chain around Kaelen's neck. But it was the boy's temperament that was the most striking. He was a protector, even in his cradle, always turning his head to ensure his sister was within sight. "The scouts returned from the southern borders this morning," Kaelen said, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the jungle met the peaks. "They found the old altars. The people are returning to the shrines. The fear is lifting." Fear is a slow poison, Kaelen, Vera said, turning to look at him. Her dignity arc was finally complete. She no longer stood as a prisoner or a victim of his desire. She stood as his equal, the divine speaker who had saved his soul by breaking his heart. It will take generations to wash the mud from this clearing. Then we have work to do, Kaelen said. He reached out, his hand covering Vera's on the cold stone. It was no longer a touch of possession, but one of partnership. I have drafted the new decree. The blood law is burned. From this day, the law of the North is the law of the hearth. No life shall be taken without a jury of peers, and no healer shall ever be questioned for their gift. Vera looked down at the courtyard below. The execution block had been removed. In its place, the people had planted a white bark rowan tree. It was a small gesture, but in a land built on stone and silver, it was a revolution. You are a different man than the one who knelt in that mud, Vera observed softly. I am a man who was shown mercy by the one person who owed me none, Kaelen replied, his golden eyes softening as they locked onto hers. I spent my life building a cage, thinking it was a kingdom. You showed me that a king without a heart is just a jailer with a crown. The forbidden tension that had once defined them had evolved into something deeper, a true romance forged in the fires of mutual loss. They were bonded by the blood of the siblings they had lost and the children they had gained. The twins were more than just heirs. They were the reincarnation of a peace that had been stolen. As they grew, the girl would teach the North how to heal, and the boy would teach them how to defend that healing without becoming monsters. The council members, what of them? Vera asked. Exiled to the barren wastes, Kaelen said. They will live out their days in the silence they tried to force on everyone else. I would have executed them once, but I realized I do not want our children to grow up in a home where the soil is always red. Vera leaned her head against Kaelen's shoulder. The authority imbalance was gone, replaced by a shared weight of responsibility. She looked at the twins, Lyrian and Elias, the living bridge between two warring bloodlines. The jungle justice was a ghost of the past. Look, Vera whispered, pointing toward the valley. Below them, the first flowers of spring were breaking through the thinning snow mountain lilies, white and pure. They were the same flowers Lyrian used to weave into her hair. The winter is over, Kaelen said, drawing her closer. And the story begins, Vera replied. The High Commander and the Divine Speaker stood together on the edge of a new era. They were flawed, scarred, and burdened by the memories of those they had failed, but they were no longer alone. As the sun rose over the iron peaks, bathing the world in a warm golden light, the unlawful killings stopped. The healers returned to the woods, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the North breathed. Dignity had found its way home. And so he knelt not before a law, but before the woman who taught him the weight of a single soul. If her journey from the mud of the clearing to the heights of the fortress moved something in you, share this with someone who believes that even the deepest wounds can grow into the strongest trees. Subscribe to Judy's Romance Library so the next episode of The North never passes you by. Until we meet again, this has been Judy's Romance Library.